The wheels of the Boeing 777 touched down at Denver International Airport with a gentle thud that barely stirred Carlos from his light sleep. After 14 hours in the air, flying from Manila to the United States, he was finally home. Well, not exactly home, but back on American soil, where he had lived for the past 15 years. Carlos stretched his arms and rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache that came with long flights. The businessman sitting next to him was already grabbing his carry-on from the overhead compartment, eager to get off the plane. Carlos took his time. He had learned patience during his years in the military. Rushing never seemed to help much anyway as he walked through the jet bridge. Carlos thought about the week he had just spent in the Philippines. It had been good to see his family again, especially his aging mother, who still lived in the same small house where he grew up. She had cooked his favorite dishes every single day, insisting he was too skinny despite his athletic build. His younger sister had laughed at how their mother still treated her successful older brother like he was 12 years old. The terminal was buzzing with the usual airport chaos. Families reuniting with tears and hugs, business travelers checking their phones while walking at lightning speed, and tourists looking slightly lost as they tried to figure out where to go next. Carlos had seen it all countless times, but he still found airports fascinating. So many different stories crossing paths in one place. He made his way toward the security checkpoint that would take him to his connecting flight to Washington, D.C. His small rolling suitcase followed obediently behind him, and his laptop bag sat comfortably on his shoulder. Carlos always traveled light. Old habits from his military days, when you learned to live with just what you could carry. The security line moved slowly, which was normal for a Friday afternoon. Carlos pulled out his phone and checked his messages. His colleague had sent him updates about the project they were working on, and his sister had already posted pictures from dinner last night on social media. He smiled at the photos. His nephew had gotten taller since his last visit. When it was finally his turn, Carlos placed his laptop bag and shoes in the plastic bins, just like everyone else. His small bottle of prescription medication went into the clear bag with his travel-sized toiletries. He had been taking the same medication for years to help with an old injury from his service days. Nothing dramatic, just something to help his knee on long flights and cold mornings. The TSA agent, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, smiled at him as she checked his boarding pass and ID. Everything seemed routine until Carlos walked through the metal detector and it beeped. He stepped back, knowing the drill. Sometimes his belt buckle set it off. Sometimes the metal pins in his knee from an old military injury. A male TSA officer approached him. Carlos had seen the type before, young, trying to look tough, with that particular swagger that some people get when they are given a uniform and a little bit of authority. The name tag read Morrison, and his expression was already annoyed before he even spoke. Morrison gestured for Carlos to step aside for additional screening. No problem, Carlos thought. This happens sometimes. He raised his arms as Morrison ran the handheld metal detector over his body. The device beeped near his knee, just as Carlos expected. "What's that?" Morrison asked, his voice sharp. "I have some metal pins in my knee from an old injury," Carlos explained calmly. "I can show you the medical documentation if you need it." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Step over here," he said, pointing to a separate area away from the main line. Carlos followed, still calm. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he knew that staying cool usually made things go smoother. Behind him, other passengers continued through security without any issues. A businessman in an expensive suit walked through the same metal detector that had beeped for Carlos, but it stayed silent. Morrison began going through Carlos's belongings more thoroughly than necessary. He opened every pocket of the laptop bag, unzipped every compartment of the small suitcase, and examined each item like he was looking for hidden treasure. "What's this?" Morrison held up the small prescription bottle. "Pain medication for my knee," Carlos replied. "The prescription label is right there on the bottle." Morrison studied the label for a long time, longer than needed to read a simple prescription. Carlos noticed other TSA agents glancing over, some looking uncomfortable with how long this was taking. "Why were you in the Philippines?" Morrison asked suddenly. The question caught Carlos off guard. It was not part of normal security screening, and the way Morrison asked it made it sound almost accusatory. Visiting family, Carlos answered truthfully. What kind of family? My mother and sister live there? Morrison continued his search, now taking items out of Carlos's suitcase and placing them on the metal table. Clean shirts, a few souvenirs for friends, some dried mangoes his mother had insisted he bring back. Each item was examined like it. Might contain something dangerous? Carlos glanced around and noticed that other passengers were starting to stare. A young couple waiting in line whispered to each other while looking in his direction. An elderly man shook his head disapprovingly, though Carlos was not sure if the disapproval was directed at him or at the extended screening process. Sir, is there a problem? Carlos asked politely. Yeah, I have a connecting flight to catch. Morrison looked up sharply. I'll decide when we're done here. A. The tone was unnecessarily harsh, and Carlos felt his jaw tighten slightly. He had been spoken to that way before, years ago, when he was younger and less experienced in dealing with difficult situations. Back then, he might have responded with matching attitude. Now, he simply nodded and waited. A female TSA supervisor walked by and glanced at the situation. She paused for a moment, seeming to consider whether she should intervene, but then continued, walking. Carlos hoped she might come back, but she disappeared into the crowd of passengers and security personnel. Morrison was now repacking Carlos's suitcase. The souvenirs were shoved in roughly, and the clean shirts that Carlos had folded neatly were now wrinkled. It was a small thing, but it felt deliberate and disrespectful. You travel to the Philippines often? Morrison asked, while continuing to handle Carlos's belongings. A few times a year to see family, Carlos replied, wondering why this information mattered for airport security. Interesting, Morrison said, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but interesting. Carlos checked his watch. His connecting flight was still 2 hours away, so he was not in immediate danger of missing it. But this whole process was taking much longer than normal. Around him, dozens of other passengers had gone through security without any delays at all. The extended screening was starting to feel less. It's like routine security and more like something else entirely. Carlos had experienced this kind of treatment before, though not often and not recently. It was the feeling of being singled out, of being made to feel like he did not belong, like he was automatically suspicious simply because of how he looked or where he had been. He took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. Getting upset would only make things worse, and he had learned long ago that patience was often the best weapon against prejudice and ignorance. Morrison was now examining Carlos's laptop, opening it and pressing the power button. To turn it on, Carlos said. X-ray machine already scanned it. Morrison ignored him and waited for the laptop to boot up. When the desktop appeared, he began clicking through folders randomly, though he clearly had no idea what he was looking for. Carlos felt his patience beginning to wear thin, but he maintained his calm exterior. Something told him this situation was about to get much worse before it got better. Carlos watched as Morrison clicked through his laptop files with increasing frustration. The officer clearly had no idea what he was looking for, but seemed determined to find something, anything, that would justify this extended search. Work, documents, family photos from his recent trip, and a few downloaded movies for the long flight home. Nothing that should concern airport security. What's this folder? Morrison demanded, pointing at a directory labeled Project Files. Work. Documents, Carlos replied calmly. I'm a consultant for government agencies. Those are just reports and presentations. Morrison's eyes lit up with suspicion. Government work? What kind of government work? Carlos hesitated. His actual job was sensitive, and he usually kept details vague when traveling. Security consulting, he said simply. Security consulting for who? Morrison pressed, his voice getting louder. Other passengers in the security line were definitely staring now. Carlos could see phones being pulled out, probably to record what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable scene. A mother with 2 small children was trying to distract them from watching, but even the kids seemed to sense something was wrong. I work with various federal agencies, Carlos said, keeping his voice low and steady. Look, officer, I really don't understand why this is taking so long. I've been through airport security thousands of times without any issues. Morrison slammed the laptop shut harder than necessary. Are you telling me how to do my job? Hey. Sir, I'm just saying that I have a connecting flight, and this seems like much more screening than usual. I decide what's usual and what's not, Morrison snapped. Empty your pockets. All of them. Carlos had already emptied his pockets during the initial screening, but he complied again. Wallet, phone, a few receipts from his trip, some loose change, and a small challenge coin from his old military unit, a keepsake he always carried. Morrison grabbed the challenge coin and examined it closely. What's this? It's a military challenge coin. Memento from my service. You were in the military? Morrison's tone suggested this somehow made things worse instead of better. Yes, I served for 8 years before getting into consulting work. Morrison pocketed the coin instead of placing it with Carlos's other belongings. I'll need to have this checked out. Checked out for what? It's just a piece of metal with my unit's insignia on it. That's for me to determine. Carlos felt a flash of anger. That coin had been given to him by his commanding officer on the day he left active duty. It had been with him through job interviews, business meetings, and family gatherings. It was one of his most treasured possessions, representing years of service and sacrifice. Sir, I'd really appreciate getting that back. It has sentimental value. Everything has sentimental value when you get caught, Morrison replied with a smirk. Caught with what? I haven't done anything wrong. A TSA supervisor approached, not the same woman from earlier, but a tall man with graying hair who looked like he had been doing this job for decades. Carlos felt relieved, thinking someone with more experience would straighten this situation out. Everything okay here, Morrison? Supervisor asked. Just doing a thorough check on this passenger, Morrison replied. Found some suspicious items, and he's been uncooperative. Carlos opened his mouth to object but stopped himself. He had learned in the military that sometimes you had to pick your battles carefully. Getting into an argument with Morrison in front of his supervisor would only make things worse. The supervisor glanced at Carlos's belongings spread across the table. Then at Carlos himself. For a moment, Carlos thought he saw an understanding in the man's eyes, maybe even sympathy. But then the supervisor simply nodded at Morrison. Carry on, he said, and walked away. Carlos felt his heart sink. Even the supervisor was going to let this continue. Morrison seemed emboldened by his boss's apparent approval. Turn around and put your hands on the table, he ordered. For what? Pat down search. I already went through the metal detector and the hand scanner. Why do I need a pat down because I said so? Carlos turned around and placed his hands on the metal table, trying to ignore the stares and whispered comments from other passengers. He could hear someone behind him saying this is ridiculous, and another voice agreeing. A few people were definitely recording with their phones now. Morrison began the pat-down, but it was more aggressive and thorough than necessary. He spent extra time checking areas that had already been cleared by the metal detector, and his movements seemed designed more to humiliate than to actually find anything dangerous. This is harassment, Carlos said quietly, trying not to let his voice carry to the other passengers. This is security, Morrison shot back. Maybe if you had been more cooperative from the start, we could have finished this quickly. I've been completely cooperative. I've answered every question and followed every instruction. You've been argumentative and suspicious from the moment I approached you. Carlos almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He had been nothing but polite and patient, even as Morrison had turned a routine security check into something that felt more like an interrogation. The pat-down finally ended. But Morrison was not finished. He began going through Carlos's belongings again, this time even more slowly and deliberately. It felt like he was stalling, trying to drag this out as long as possible. Officer Morrison, Carlos said, making sure to use the man's name from his badge. I've missed connecting flights before due to security delays, and I understand that safety is important. But this feels excessive. What exactly are you looking for? Morrison looked up with an expression that was pure hostility. I'm looking for whatever you're hiding. I'm not hiding anything. That's what they all say. Comments stung because of its implications. They all say, who was they? Carlos had a pretty good idea what Morrison meant, and it had nothing to do with actual security concerns by now. A small crowd had gathered around the security checkpoint. Some people were still trying to get through the line, but others had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Carlos could hear bits of conversation from the crowd. Why is this taking so long? Poor guy. He's just trying to catch his flight. Someone should call a manager. I'm recording this in case something happens. Morrison seemed to feed off the attention. He was clearly enjoying being the center of the drama, having power over someone who couldn't fight back without making things much worse. I'm going to need to call for additional screening, Morrison announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Additional screening for what? Carlos asked. You've already searched everything I have twice for your attitude and suspicious behavior. Carlos felt his control starting to slip. This was no longer about security or safety. This was about something else entirely, something ugly and personal that had nothing to do with keeping airports safe. My attitude. I've been nothing but respectful and cooperative. Arguing with security personnel is not cooperative. I haven't argued with anyone. I've asked legitimate questions about why this is taking so long. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Carlos could smell coffee on his breath. Are you calling me a liar? The question was clearly a trap. No matter how Carlos answered, Morrison would use it as justification for whatever he planned to do next. Carlos took a deep breath, tried one more time to de-escalate the situation. Officer, I just want to get to my gate and catch my flight home. I'm not trying to cause any problems. Is there something specific you need from me to finish this screening? Morrison smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. Yeah, there is something. I need from you. I need you to learn some respect. And that's when Carlos knew this situation was about to get much worse. The words, learn some respect, hung in the air like a challenge. Carlos felt every muscle in his body tense. Years of military training had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to explode, and all his instincts were screaming warnings right now. Excuse me? Carlos said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison stepped even closer, clearly trying to intimidate him. You heard me? You people think you can just waltz through here like you own the place, but I'm here to remind you that you don't. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. You people? He couldn't hide the shock in his voice. Don't act like you don't know what I mean, Morrison sneered. Carlos glanced around, hoping someone in authority would step in. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and he could see several people with their phones out, recording everything. A few passengers looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to help but didn't know how. Others just stared, treating the whole thing like some kind of entertainment. Officer Morrison, Carlos said, trying to keep his voice steady. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I just want to collect my belongings and get to my gate. The only misunderstanding is you. Thinking you can disrespect me and get away with it? Morrison grabbed Carlos by the arm, his grip unnecessarily tight. You're coming with me for questioning. Questioning about what? Carlos asked, but he didn't resist. His military training had taught him that sometimes you had to endure unfairness to avoid making a bad situation catastrophic. It's about your suspicious behavior and attitude. Carlos allowed himself to be led toward a small office area behind the security checkpoint. He could hear murmurs from the crowd behind him, and someone called out, "This isn't right." But no one actually stepped forward to help. As they walked, Carlos caught sight of the female TSA supervisor he had seen earlier. She was watching the scene with a troubled expression, and for a moment, their eyes met. She looked like she wanted to say something. But Morrison was already pushing Carlos toward the office door. The small room was sterile and cold. With just a metal table and 2 chairs, Morrison shoved Carlos down into one of the chairs harder than necessary. Stay there, Morrison commanded, then stepped outside. Carlos could hear him talking to someone in the hallway, but couldn't make out the words. He took a deep breath and tried to center himself. This whole situation was insane. He had been through airport security hundreds of times without incident. He had a spotless record, security clearances that most people could only dream of, and a background that had been investigated by federal agencies multiple times, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal because one small-minded officer had decided to make an example of him. The door opened, and Morrison came back in, followed by another officer Carlos hadn't seen before. This one was older, with cold eyes and a permanent scowl that suggested he had been doing this job too long. "So you're the troublemaker," the new officer said without introduction. "I haven't caused any trouble," Carlos replied. Throughout this entire process, "That's not what Officer Morrison tells me." Carlos looked at Morrison, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed, looking smug. "Officer Morrison has been searching my belongings for over an hour without finding anything suspicious. I've answered every question and followed every instruction. I just want to know why this is happening." The older officer sat down across from Carlos. "Why were you in the Philippines?" "Visiting family. My mother and sister live there." "How long were you there?" "A week." "What did you do there?" Carlos felt like he was being interrogated for a crime he didn't commit. "I spent time with my family. We had dinner together, visited. Some relatives, went to church. Normal family things." "Any business meetings?" "No. No contacts with local organizations. It's just family and old friends." But the questions continued for another 10 minutes, each one more invasive than the last. Asked about his job, his income, his travel history, even his military service. Carlos answered everything truthfully, but he could see that nothing he said was going to satisfy them. Morrison had been quiet during the questioning, but now he spoke up. He's been uncooperative and argumentative from the start. Refused to answer questions. Got aggressive when I tried to do my job. Carlos stared at him in disbelief. "That's completely untrue. I've been polite and cooperative throughout this entire ordeal." "Don't lie to us," Morrison snapped.
"Hey, we have witnesses."
"Who saw your behavior? What witnesses?" "The other passengers who were recording your harassment." Morrison's face flushed red. "Harassment? I was doing my job." "Your job is to keep airports safe, not to intimidate innocent travelers." The older officer held up his hand. "That's enough. Both of you." He turned to Carlos. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to finish searching your belongings, and if everything checks out, you'll be free to go." "You've already searched everything twice," Carlos pointed out. "Then a third time won't hurt." Carlos wanted to argue, but he knew it would only make things worse. "Fine. But I want to file a complaint about Officer Morrison's conduct."
"What?"
Morrison stepped forward aggressively. "What did you say?" "I said I want to file a complaint. This whole situation has been unprofessional and inappropriate." "You want to file a complaint against me?" "Yes, I do." Morrison's face was getting redder by the second. "You ungrateful piece of," he caught himself before finishing the sentence. Carlos had heard enough to know where it was going. "Officer." Morrison, the older officer, warned, but his tone was mild, like he was correcting a child rather than stopping a serious breach of conduct. Morrison took a deep breath, but his eyes were still blazing with anger. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said to Carlos. "Actually, I think you're the one who has no idea who you're messing with," Carlos replied quietly. It was a mistake. Carlos knew it as soon as the words left his mouth. Morrison interpreted it as a threat, and his face went from red to purple.
"You threatening me?"
Morrison demanded. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just saying that this situation could have been handled differently." But Morrison was past listening to reason. "That's it. You're under arrest." "Under arrest for what?" "Disorderly conduct and threatening a federal officer." Carlos couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I haven't been disorderly, and I certainly haven't threatened anyone." Morrison was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "This is insane," Carlos said, but he knew better than to resist. He had seen too many situations escalate when people fought back against authority. Even when that authority was clearly wrong, he turned around and felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists. The sound seemed to echo in the small room, final and ominous. "Jake Morrison, what are you doing?" The voice came from the doorway. Carlos turned to see a woman in a TSA supervisor uniform standing there, her face a mixture of shock and anger. "Supervisor Rodriguez Morrison," said suddenly, looking less confident. This passenger was being disruptive and threatening. Supervisor Rodriguez looked at Carlos, then at Morrison, then at the older officer who had been conducting the questioning. Her expression suggested she was trying to piece together what had happened. Threatening how? She asked. Morrison hesitated. He was uncooperative, and he made threatening statements. The kind of threatening statements. Another hesitation. He said, I didn't know who I was messing with. Supervisor Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. That's what you're calling a threat? It was the way he said it. Rodriguez walked over to Carlos. Sir, what's your name? Carlos Mendoza?
Else.
She pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Carlos couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see her expression changing as she listened to whoever was on the other end. When she hung up, she looked at Morrison with an expression that could have melted steel. Officer Morrison, she said, slowly, you need to remove those handcuffs right now. But Supervisor, right now, Morrison. Something in her tone made Morrison comply immediately. As the handcuffs came off, Carlos rubbed his wrists and wondered what had just changed. Rodriguez looked at him with what might have been respect or possibly fear. Mr. Mendoza, she said carefully, I think we need to talk. Supervisor Rodriguez closed the office door behind her and turned to face Carlos with an expression he couldn't quite read. Morrison stood frozen near the wall, looking confused and suddenly worried. The older officer who had been asking questions earlier seemed to shrink into his chair. Mr. Mendoza, Rodriguez said carefully, I just spoke with someone from the Department of Homeland Security. They're very interested in what happened here today. Carlos said nothing, but Morrison's face went pale. Homeland Security? Why would they? Because Rodriguez interrupted, still looking at Carlos. Mr. Mendoza isn't just any passenger. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Carlos could see Morrison's mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. The older officer cleared his throat nervously. I don't understand, Morrison said weakly. Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen a few times. Carlos Mendoza, a former Navy SEAL decorated veteran with 2 tours in Afghanistan, currently holds a top-secret security clearance and works as a senior advisor for the Department of Homeland Security. She looked up from the tablet. His specialty is airport security assessment. Morrison's legs seemed to give out, and he had to grab the wall for support. Airport security assessment? That's right, Rodriguez continued, her voice getting colder with each word. Mr. Mendoza travels to airports across the country, evaluating our procedures and identifying potential problems in our security protocols. Carlos watched Morrison's face cycle through confusion, realization, and then pure terror. The older officer was staring at his hands, probably wondering how his career was going to survive this. The person I just spoke with, Rodriguez continued, was very surprised to hear that one of their top consultants had been handcuffed and arrested at Denver International Airport. They're sending people here right now. Morrison finally found his voice. I didn't know. He didn't tell you what? Rodriguez snapped. That he was important enough to deserve basic human dignity. That he had the right to be treated with respect like any other passenger. But he was acting suspicious. Suspicious how? By being polite? Yeah. By asking reasonable questions about why his screening was taking so long? By carrying prescription medication and family photos? Carlos had remained quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke up. Supervisor Rodriguez, I appreciate you clearing this up, but what happened here isn't about my job or my security clearance. It's about how Officer Morrison treated me as a person. Rodriguez nodded. You're absolutely right, but unfortunately, some people only understand consequences when they realize they've messed with someone who has the power to create real problems for them. She turned back to Morrison. Do you have any idea what kind of report Mr. Mendoza is going to file about this incident? Morrison looked like he might be sick. A report? A federal report that will be read by the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Administrator of TSA, and probably several congressional committees. A report that will detail exactly how you profiled, harassed, and illegally detained one of their senior advisors. The older officer finally spoke up. Maybe we can work something out. Rodriguez's voice was incredulous. You think this is something you can just smooth over? Do you realize that everything that happened here was recorded by passengers? Those videos are probably already on social media. Carlos pulled out his phone and did a quick search. Sure enough, videos of his detention were already appearing on various platforms. One had been shared hundreds of times with the caption, TSA officer arrests innocent passenger for no reason. Another was titled, Racial Profiling at Denver Airport. It's already going viral, Carlos said, showing them his phone screen. Morrison slumped against the wall. This is a disaster. It gets worse, Rodriguez said. Mr. Mendoza wasn't just here as a regular passenger. He was actually conducting an undercover evaluation of our security procedures. This incident is going to be part of his official assessment. Carlos looked at her with surprise. It wasn't exactly true, but he decided not to correct her. Sometimes the truth needed a little help to make its point. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. Undercover evaluation. That's right. And based on what I've heard about your behavior today, I'm guessing his report isn't going to be very favorable. There was a knock on the door, and another TSA supervisor entered. Behind him were two men in dark suits who had the unmistakable look of federal agents. Mr. Mendoza, one of the agents said. I'm Agent Peterson from DHS. We understand there was an incident. Carlos stood up and shook the agent's hand. Yes, there was. Agent Peterson looked around the room, his eyes stopping on Morrison. We'd like to get your account of what happened, if you don't mind, of course. As Carlos began recounting the events, Morrison seemed to shrink smaller and smaller. Every detail Carlos shared, the extended search, the inappropriate questions, the escalating hostility painted a picture of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. And then he arrested me, Carlos concluded, claiming I had threatened him. Agent Peterson turned to Morrison. Is that accurate? Morrison opened his mouth, but no words came out. The older officer spoke up instead. There may have been some misunderstandings? Misunderstandings? The second agent said. About what? Well, the passenger seemed ... different, suspicious. Suspicious how? Another long pause. Morrison finally managed to speak. He was traveling from the Philippines, and he was asking questions about our procedures. Agent Peterson raised an eyebrow. He was asking questions about TSA procedures. Yes. Mean the same TSA procedures that Mr. Mendoza helped design in the first place? Morrison looked confused again. Helped design them? Carlos nodded. I've been working with TSA for 3 years, helping to improve security protocols and training programs. I've probably been through more airports than most TSA officers. Agent Peterson pulled out a notebook. Mr. Mendoza, would you say this? Incident reflects systemic problems with TSA procedures, or was this an isolated case of poor judgment? It was a loaded question, and Carlos knew his answer would have consequences for a lot of people. He looked at Morrison, who was staring at the floor, then at the older officer who had participated in the interrogation. I think Carlos said, carefully, that most TSA officers do their jobs professionally and with respect for passengers. But this incident shows what can happen when someone lets personal bias override their training and common sense. Morrison looked up hopefully, as if Carlos might somehow save him from the consequences of his actions. However, Carlos continued, the fact that this was allowed to escalate as far as it did suggests there might be problems with supervision and accountability. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. She had failed to intervene when she had the chance. And now that failure was part of the official record. Agent Peterson made notes as Carlos spoke. Will you be filing formal complaints? Yes, I will. Multiple complaints, actually, with TSA, with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and with my supervisors at DHS. Morrison made a small sound, almost like a whimper. Something else, Agent Peterson said. The videos of this incident are spreading rapidly on social media. The TSA administrator is getting calls from reporters asking for comment. This is becoming a public relations nightmare. Rodriguez closed her eyes. How bad is it? Agent Peterson showed her his phone. The hashtag Sabus is trending nationally. Several civil rights organizations have already issued statements. A congressman is calling for hearings. Carlos watched. Morrison processed this information. The man who had seemed so powerful and intimidating an hour ago now looked like he was about to cry. What happens now? Morrison asked quietly. Agent Peterson looked at his partner, then at Carlos. That depends on several factors. But I can tell you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated, and appropriate actions will be taken. Morrison finally understood that his career and possibly his freedom was in serious jeopardy. The power he had wielded so carelessly against Carlos had backfired spectacularly. "Mr. Mendoza," Agent Peterson said, "we'll need you to come with us to provide a full statement. And we'll need copies of those videos from the passengers who recorded the incident." As they prepared to leave the small office, Carlos looked back at Morrison one last time. The officer was sitting in the chair now, head in his hands, facing the consequences of his actions. Sometimes justice came slowly. It had come very quickly indeed. 3 weeks later, Carlos sat in a comfortable conference room at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters in Washington, D.C. Across from him sat the TSA administrator, his 2 assistant directors, and a representative from the Civil Rights Division. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss his recommendations following the Denver incident. But Carlos knew it was about much more than that. "Mr. Mendoza," the administrator began, "we want to start by apologizing for what happened to you at Denver International Airport. The behavior you experienced was completely unacceptable and goes against everything we try to teach our officers." Carlos nodded. "I appreciate that. But I want to be clear that this isn't just about what happened. To me, it's about what happens to thousands of other travelers who don't have the resources or connections to fight back." The videos from Denver had indeed gone viral, accumulating millions of views across different platforms. News outlets had picked up the story, civil rights organizations had held press conferences, and members of Congress had demanded answers. The incident had become a national conversation about racial profiling, abuse of authority, and accountability in federal agencies. "We understand," the administrator continued. "That's why we've asked you here today. We want to implement real changes, not just issue statements and hope this goes away." Carlos had spent the past 3 weeks thinking about this moment. Part of him was angry enough to demand that heads roll, that people be fired and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But another part of him, the part that had spent years in the military and working in government, knew that real change happened through systemic improvements, not just punishment. "What happened to Officer Morrison?" Carlos asked. The civil rights representative spoke up. "He's been terminated from TSA and is facing federal charges for civil rights violations and abuse of authority. The case is still working its way through the courts." Carlos felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Morrison had brought this on himself, but Carlos took no joy in seeing anyone's life destroyed, even someone who had treated him so badly. What about the older officer who participated in the interrogation, suspended without pay and required to complete extensive retraining before he can return to duty? He'll also be on probation for 2 years. And Supervisor Rodriguez? She received a formal reprimand and additional training. She should have intervened earlier, but we acknowledge that she did ultimately stop the situation from getting worse. Carlos leaned back in his chair. The punishment seemed appropriate, but he was more interested in what would be done to prevent similar incidents in the future. "Tell me about the changes you're proposing," he said. The administrator opened a thick folder. "Based on your recommendations and our own internal review, we're implementing several new policies. First, all TSA officers will be required to complete enhanced bias awareness training every 6 months instead of annually. That's a good start, but training only works if people take it seriously, which is why we're also implementing a new reporting system. Passengers can now file complaints directly through a mobile app, and those complaints will be investigated by an independent office, not by TSA supervisors." Carlos was impressed. That could make a real difference. "We're also installing new recording equipment at all security checkpoints, not just security cameras, but audio recording as well. Officers will know their interactions with passengers are being monitored and recorded." "What about consequences for supervisors who fail to intervene when they see inappropriate behavior?" New policy requires supervisors to step in whenever they observe potential misconduct. Failure to do so will result in automatic disciplinary action. The changes sounded promising, but Carlos had been in government long enough to know that policies were only as good as their implementation. "Will you ensure these policies are actually followed and not just written down and forgotten?" The assistant administrator spoke up for the first time. "We're creating a new position, Director of Passenger Rights and Accountability. This person will report directly to the administrator and will have the authority to investigate complaints, review security footage, and recommend disciplinary actions. Who are you considering for that position? The administrator smiled. We were hoping you might be interested. Carlos was genuinely surprised. You have the security expertise, the military background, and now first-hand experience with what can go wrong. Plus, passengers would trust someone who has been through what they might go through. It was tempting. Carlos could imagine the impact he could have in a role like that, ensuring that other travelers wouldn't face the harassment and humiliation he had experienced. But he also knew that real change often happens slowly in government, and he wasn't sure he had the patience for bureaucratic politics. Can I think about it? Of course. But there's something else we want to discuss. The civil rights representative pulled out another folder. We've been analyzing complaint data from the past 5 years, looking for patterns. What happened to you in Denver wasn't isolated. We found dozens of similar incidents involving passengers who fit certain profiles. Carlos wasn't surprised, but it was still disappointing to see it confirmed. Most of these complaints were dismissed or resulted in minimal disciplinary action. The officers involved often claimed they were just following security protocols, and their supervisors backed them up. And now, we're reopening every case where the complaint involved potential bias or excessive screening. We're also reaching out to the passengers who filed those complaints to let them know their concerns are being taken seriously. Carlos thought about all the travelers who had gone through experiences similar to his, but without the resources to fight back. People who had been humiliated, delayed, or mistreated, and then told it was all just part of keeping everyone safe. What about compensation for those passengers? We're working on that. It's complicated because many of these incidents happened years ago, but we want to do right by the people who were wronged. The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from new training procedures to updated complaint processes. Carlos was impressed by the thoroughness of the proposed changes, but he also knew that the real test would come in implementation. As the meeting was ending, the administrator had one final question. Mr. Mendoza, if you could give one piece of advice to every TSA officer in the country, what would it be? Carlos thought for a moment. Remember that every passenger you interact with is someone's family member. Yeah, their fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, people just trying to get home or go on vacation or conduct business. Treat them the way you would want your own family to be treated. 2 months later, Carlos was back at Denver International Airport. This time, he was there for a ceremony announcing the new passenger rights policies. The irony wasn't lost on him returning to the place where his ordeal begun to celebrate changes that came about because of that ordeal. Security screening went smoothly. The TSA officers were professional and courteous, though Carlos suspected they had been briefed about who he was. Supervisor Rodriguez was there, and she approached him before he left the checkpoint. Mr. Mendoza, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. I should have stepped in sooner. We all learned something from that day, Carlos replied. The important thing is that changes are being made. Heard you turned down the director position. Carlos nodded. I decided I can do more good continuing my consulting work, visiting airports around the country, and seeing how these new policies are actually working. As he walked toward his gate, Carlos reflected on how much had changed since that awful day 3 weeks earlier. Morrison was facing justice. New policies were being implemented, and a national conversation about bias and accountability was taking place. But the most important change, Carlos thought, was simpler than policies or procedures. It was the recognition that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. That lesson had come at a high price. But if it prevented even one other person from going through what he had experienced then, maybe it had been worth it. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes justice arrives exactly when it's needed most.